two classes after today. What I propose is the following. Today, I'm going to deal with the explanatory assumptions, the social theoretical assumptions of the programmatic argument that I've been developing in the course. And that's today, April 3rd. In the next class on April 10th, I'm going to deal with the normative assumptions and the conception of the division between the left and the right, the progressives and the conservatives, that informs these programmatic arguments. And in the last class, on April 17th, I won't make any presentation at all, and I'd like you to bring your ideas, your concerns, your questions, possibly related to the papers you're writing, and the class will be devoted exclusively to that discussion for as long as you want to talk. Now, remember from the beginning of our exploration, the idea that we all suffer in the contemporary world from a programmatic aphasia. We don't know how to think and to argue programmatically about alternatives. And this lack of a credible way of thinking about transformation, especially structural transformation of the formative institutional arrangements and of the ideological assumptions related to them, immensely aggravates our programmatic disorientation. And because of this lack of a way of understanding and discussing structural change, we fall back on a false criterion of political realism, which is proximity to the existent. And that helps explain this false dilemma that we encounter today in programmatic argument. The dilemma of utopianism and triviality. As I mentioned at the outset of the course, I propose something close to what exists. You say that's interesting, but it's utopian. I propose something far away from what exists. You say that's feasible, but it's trivial. And that's almost anything that can be proposed in the contemporary climate of opinion is likely to be dismissed as either utopian or trivial. Now, I remarked then that the idea of this dilemma arises from a misunderstanding of the nature of programmatic arguments about alternatives. They're not about blueprints, they're about successions. And I said then, it's not like architecture, it's like music. It's about a succession of steps. The two most important attributes of a programmatic argument is that it marks a direction, because the idea of the direction is always susceptible to revision, and that it selects in the particular historical circumstances the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. But this problem of how to talk and how to think about alternatives is enormously aggravated by a feature of the history of ideas, which is that we have no credible and usable way of speaking about what matters most, which is the nature and the transformation of regimes, of the institutional and ideological structures that shape the surface conflicts of social life, and especially the conflicts over the use of the resources of economic capital, political power, and cultural authority by which we create the future within the present. The central object of ambition in social theory is always the elucidation of structure and of its transformation, its nature, its composition, the way it changes, the way we can change it. And the overriding object of ambition in politics is the preservation or the transformation of such regimes. The regime is the structure, that's a synonym for the idea. What distinguishes ambitious politics from routine politics is precisely this, that it has structural ambitions. And the central object, it's locked, right? The last great moment of refoundation in the rich North Atlantic world, the last great moment in which the institutional and ideological structure was revived, the last settlement was the social democratic or social liberal settlement of the mid-20th century. And the main object of the course has been the discussion of its failures and of its possible successor, what should and can come afterward. And that is the salient instance of structural change that has served as the object of our attention. Now then, on that view, the crucial social theoretical assumptions of a programmatic argument have to do with the theory of regimes. And this is now the theme I want to develop in today's class. Why or how do we not have now an adequate theory of regimes, of formative institutional and ideological structures, and where should we look for one? Now, the idea that the theory of regimes is the central object of concern in social political theory is an ancient idea. This was the focus of Aristotle's political theory, the theory of regimes. And in the modern period of Montesquieu's theory, they had the idea that there was a system and that the system always had both an institutional side and an ideological side, which they sometimes call the spirit of the regime, the form of consciousness which accompanied and sustained the institutional form. And in the subsequent history of social theory, of classical European social theory, the most consummate achievement in the theory of structure was Marx's theory of the modes of production, the theory which by far exerted the greatest influence on the left throughout the world. The anchor, the initial paradigmatic statement in this theory, was implicit in Marx's critique of English political economy. The English economists, Marx said, had claimed that there were universal laws of economic life. But what they claimed to be universal and eternal laws were only laws of a particular regime which Marx labeled capitalism. And now the theoretical assumptions of this Marxist system have, for the most part, become literally incredible. William James said people believe everything they can, and now they can believe in the assumptions of the system. So what was the central insight? The revolutionary insight, which whatever else happens now in the history of social thought must be preserved and deepened. The revolutionary insight is that the arrangements of society, the institutional and ideological structures, are made and imagined. That we made them, and as Vikos already said at the end of the 18th century, because we made them, we can hope to understand them. With the intimate and superior knowledge that the Creator has of his creations, rather than just from outside in the way, for example, we understand the atomic structure of natural objects. Now let's pause for a moment to think about this revolutionary insight, that these structures of social life, the transformation of which we've been discussing in the course, are like frozen us, frozen humanity. We made them, and now they're crystallized. So we could think of this by analogy, as I suggested once before here, to a game of musical chairs. So the music is the conflict, the endless practical and visionary strife in history. When the music stops, we sit down on the chairs. The chairs are the structures. And the chairs are then this kind of frozen politics. If we think of politics expansively, not just as conflict over the mastery and uses of governmental power, but as conflict over all the terms of social life, then conflict is, the politics in this ample sense, is the force from which the structures arise. And the structures are the crystallized residue of this endless conflict. The conflict is only temporarily or incompletely interrupted. Only interrupted for a while and only contained relatively. But insofar as it is contained, these structures emerge as the result of its temporary interruption or of its partial containment. So that idea then is an interpretation of the core revolutionary insight in this idea of classical social theory. This insight in classical European social theory, and especially in its most influential version, Marxism, was, however, circumscribed and to some extent eviscerated, hollowed out by a series of illusions, which we could call the illusions of false necessity. One of them is what we could call the closed list illusion, that there is a defined menu or set of regimes in history. For Marx, they are the modes of production: slave society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. And these assumptions are, as it were, waiting on the shelf of history to be enacted in a particular sequence. The second illusion is the indivisibility illusion. Each of these regimes is an indivisible system, which either replaced all at once, altogether, or not at all. And the third illusion is the historical laws illusion, that there are laws governing the operation of each of these regimes and their foreordained succession in history. These three illusions are not just theoretical suppositions. They have dramatic practical consequences. The effect of the combination of the closed list illusion with the historical laws illusion is that we really can't have a project. We human beings, we agents, who after all create these structures being the frozen version of us. We can't have a project because history has a project for us. If by a deluded voluntarism we insist on imagining alternatives, we will be punished. And the exemplary form of the punishment will be political defeat. The practical consequence of the second illusion, of the indivisibility illusion, that each of the regimes is an indivisible system, is a binary idea of politics. According to this idea, there are basically two types of politics. There's the reformist management of a system, and there's the revolutionary substitution of one indivisible system by another. So either we, to take the example of capitalism as one of the modes of production, either we reform capitalism or we replace it by socialism. Every type of politics will, at the end of the day, be either reformist or revolutionary. Now, I want to say, and for the moment it's just a dogmatic assertion, that all three of these illusions of false necessity are false. All are false, and not just are false, well that's a claim that we have to argue with respect to each of them, but they have become literally incredible. So they're generally not believed in, even by those who claim to be the adepts of this theoretical system. So, for example, with respect to the second illusion, the illusion of indivisibility, all real structural change in history is piecemeal, fragmentary, and can nevertheless be cumulative. The idea of some total change of the regime is, for the most part, a fantastical limiting case, which does not arise in actual experience. And now, the idea of the revolutionary substitution of one regime by another has, for the most part, become an alibi for its opposite. So the situation in the world is that many countries are governed by ex-Marxists, disenchanted Marxists, and the way they think is this. Real change would be the total substitution of this regime by another one, by socialism, whatever it means. They don't really know what it means in detail. But that's not in the cards. And if it were in the cards, it would be too dangerous. So what's left to do in the world? What's left to do in the world is to humanize capitalism by making it more social, by making it less savage, by attenuating the inequalities that it generates. So that's how the idea of total change becomes an excuse for its opposite, in the actual historical circumstance. Now, what should have occurred in the history of social theory, what should have occurred is that the original revolutionary insight that the regimes, the institutional and ideological structures are artifacts which we make. They are frozen politics. That insight should have been radicalized, should have been deepened, and should have been combined with a way of understanding the constraints on transformative action that did not imply an acceptance of the illusions. But that's not what happened. What happened, for example, in the history of Marxism is a kind of dilution. So, for example, political Marxism, emphasizing the relative autonomy of politics from the structure, or cultural Marxism, emphasizing the relative autonomy of consciousness of culture. So the system was diluted, it was watered down, rather than being replaced, rather than through the radicalization of its central insight and the combination of that insight with an alternative doctrine of constraint on transformative action. And because this theory, the Marxist theory, has exerted an immense influence on the left, what happens is that its vocabulary continues to be used by people who no longer believe in its theoretical assumptions. So, the concept of capitalism, the allusion to the idea of capitalism as a system, the idea that class conflict is the master transformative mechanism of the transformation of the regime, and so forth. They continue to use all of these words without really believing in the social theoretical presuppositions that fix the meaning of these terms. And from this arises an immense measure of disorientation, of confusion in the vocabulary of contemporary politics, especially contemporary radical politics. And what about the social sciences that arose afterwards? A simple account of that is to say, they disposed of the illusions of false necessity, but only by disposing at the same time of the central revolutionary insight. But they severed the vital link between the understanding of the actual and the imagination of the adjacent possible. How do we understand anything? We understand anything by understanding what it can become at the next moment in the realm of the adjacent, of the accessible possible, the theirs to which we can get from here. That's how we understand. We understand by relativizing the necessity or the actuality of the existent and subsuming it under a penumbra, a periphery of adjacent possibilities. That's the work of the imagination. And that's how we understand. And that's the central distinction between understanding and staring, between understanding and retrospective rationalization. But each social science severs this vital link between the actual and the adjacent possible in a different way. So take the example of the best organized and most influential social science, economics. Now, what is economics? Contrary to what you might think, economics is not the study of the economy. Because economics, after all, economics, you might say, because it's Max Weber's theory of the economy, economics. And we would say today, or the economists would say, no, it's not. It's something else. It's the sociology of economic life or something. Economics is a study of a method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. The use of this method to explain phenomena that have no apparent relation to the problems of production and exchange is economics. And the study of the economy by some other method is not economics. And what is the way in which this economics severs this link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible? So the popular conception, the popular critique of the dominant economics, of microeconomics, is that it's an idealization. Because real people aren't these rationalizing, maximizing automata. Real markets aren't perfectly competitive and so forth. The economists, of course, dismiss these critiques as stupid, as obtuse, as failures to understand what they're trying to do. The real defects of this method are of a completely different nature, and it's important to understand them given the importance of economics in our understanding of social life. So the first is the disassociation in this economics between formal analysis and empirical study. There's a great deal of logic, of formalism in economics, and now a great deal of empiricism, but they have very little to do with each other. So the central conception is the economy is a series of connected markets, which the individual economic agent, under the discipline of constraint, seeks to maximize his goals, the satisfaction of his interests, through competitive selection under this constraint of scarcity. And the method by which the economist proceeds, then, is to take this conception as the background. Now, the Austrian economist, the Austrian school, was one of the versions or variants of this early marxism, correctly understood that this was not a causal science. This was a form of logic that allowed for deductive inference from this idealization. So against the background of this theoretical conception, the economist generates models of this or that aspect of economic life. And if one model doesn't work, he simply replaces it by another model with different elements and with different values of the parameters by a succession of models. And the models are then formulated in mathematics. Now, this economics reveres mathematics, has a fascination with mathematics. But the mathematics that it deploys is a kind of toy mathematics. So this is one of the strange things about this discipline, that it has this reverence for mathematics, but it uses only primitive mathematics. No mathematics is used in economics that was invented after the middle of the 19th century. So basically, it's a series of variations on calculus. It's not like the way that mathematics is used in physics. So the economist then simply replaces one method by another method. The substitution of methods never brings into question, never brings into jeopardy the underlying theoretical picture. Because the underlying theoretical picture was never a causal picture to begin with. It was a way of thinking about the situation of the economy through the perspective of rationalization or maximization under the constraint of scarcity. So this was viewed by the early marginalists as an enormous advantage. That is, they struggled to find a method that would be invulnerable to attack. And that's why the economics that they produced has no analog in contemporary social thought other than Hans Kelsen's pure theory of law, which is the closest cousin to it. So they replaced one method by another method. Groucho Marx, not Karl Marx, said, I have principles, and if you don't like them, I have other ones. So they can replace methods. There's a succession of models, but the models never bring into question the underlying theoretical picture. This was, as I just said, it was regarded by the marginalists as an advantage. But in fact, it condemns this economics to an eternal infancy. Because if there can't be a dialectic between empirical discovery and theory, the science can't progress. And that is, in fact, the situation that we have. Then there was, in later economics, an abortive heresy, Keynes's theory, which had the potential in it to present a different vision of the economy as being in permanent disequilibrium. But the American followers of Keynes followed a way to expunge from it this transformative potential by reducing it to the theory of counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary management of the economy. So today, if you open a book about economics in the United States or anywhere in the world, the marginalist theory appears there as microeconomics, and the Keynesian alternative to it appears as a chapter in the same book, rather than as a rival theoretical paradigm under the label of macroeconomics. So, and of course later, the claim is made that everything that was in that macroeconomics could in fact be inferred from the microeconomics. So what was new in it was false, and everything else was superfluous. Now, the second defect of this economics is its deficit of institutional imagination, especially imagination about the market itself, the different ways of organizing a market economy. So there are two assumptions. The equation of maximizing rationality under the constraint of scarcity with the market, and then, more significantly, the equation of the abstract idea of the market with a particular version of the market. And then there are three versions of this idea, three forms of the economics with respect to its institutional assumptions. One version is pure economics, like the general equilibrium theories of the mid-20th century. It has no institutional assumptions, it makes no institutional assumptions, and it has no institutional consequences. So it's pure, but it's impotent in its ability to propose alternatives. The second version is fundamentalist economics, like Hayek's economics, as I said in an earlier class. At the limit, Hayek imagined that if Robinson Crusoe traded long enough on his island, he would eventually reproduce the whole system of German private law. In other words, it was the idea that implicit in spontaneous exchange among equal economic agents was the whole system of the market. It's entirely false. Nothing is implicit in it. There is no natural and necessary legal and institutional architecture of the market order, as we have been discussing throughout the course. And then there was a third version of economics with respect to the institutional assumptions, which was what you could call equivocating economics. And it is exemplified by the American practice of macroeconomics. So the object is to try to establish law-like correlations between large-scale economic aggregates, like the level of employment and the level of inflation, so-called Phillips curve. And then, of course, the challenge to this effort comes when you say these so-called law-like correlations depend on a host of background legal and institutional details. Like, are the workers organized? How are they organized? Is there unemployment insurance? Who controls monetary policy and so forth? So the law-like correlation appears to be a law, to be law-like, only if all these background arrangements are fixed. But what happens is if in the historical reality, for the most part, they are fixed, stagnant or stable, their stability then is easily confused with lawfulness. Something changes in that legal and institutional background, the Phillips curve no longer holds good. So it's equivocating because then the macroeconomist says, yes, in principle, your objection holds. But then he goes back to his analytic and argumentative practice, because so long as there is stagnation, stagnation means lawfulness in his world. So this economics is enabled to generate what would be crucial to an economic science, which is the imagination of the transformation of its structures. Like the theme which has been prominent in our discussions in the semester of how a knowledge economy for the few could be turned into a knowledge economy for the many. The third objection to this economics is that it has no proper theory of production. It only has a theory of exchange. So if you open a textbook in economics today, there may well be a chapter called Production, or the Theory of Production. But if you read it, you see it has nothing to do with the subjects we've been discussing about production, like the relation of the most advanced practice of production to the rest of the economy. It's about the substitution of some factors of production for others, and the consequent organization of different markets or market alternatives. So production appears in this economics as a shadowy extension of exchange. Under the aegis of relative prices. And this is possible because of a contingent feature of the economies with which this economics deals, namely that in them, labor can be bought and sold, one of the factors that Marx considered most distinctive to what he called capitalism. And the fourth defect of this economics can be explained by analogy to the neo-Darwinian synthesis in the life sciences. So in the life sciences, there is a theory of competitive selection, which is the Darwinian theory of natural evolution. And then there is a theory of the creation of the diverse stuff on which competitive selection acts, which is the theory of genetic mutation and recombination. Now, in this economics, the economics created by marginalism, there's only a theory of competitive selection. Where's the other half? The theory of the creation of the diverse stuff, it doesn't exist. And in fact, from the standpoint of this economics, the world might just as well be a single economic order. Why should there be different nation states, sovereign states, with different economic arrangements? It's just more transactions cost instead of the harmonization that we would seek to desire. It's like in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant makes the following remark. The dove flying in the air thinks, if only there were no air, I would fly even faster. So this is the assumption of this economics, that if only we could get rid of diversity, it would be even better, because there wouldn't be these obstacles of the lack of harmony and so forth. So I've laboriously referred to this economics as an example, because the basic idea is that in each social science, the suppression of the transformative imagination takes a different form. And so I described the form that's most influential. And let me just say a word now about the normative disciplines of political philosophy and of legal theory. So, how does the suppression of the structural imagination happen in contemporary legal theory? The central idea in legal theory was, in the 19th century, there was a dogmatic formalism, a mischaracterization of 19th century legal theory as a kind of crude deductivism or conceptualism. And now we think purposively, and we understand the law as an idealized system of policies and principles. So, and that then becomes the vocabulary in which we expound the legal architecture of the social democratic or social liberal settlement of the mid-20th century. So it's a set of accidents or compromises, of coalitions, which is represented in this legal theory. This legal theory now, from the Legal Academy of the United States and of Germany, is disseminated throughout the world as the wave of the future and the providential alternative to 19th century conceptualism, when it is in fact just a crude mischaracterization of the earlier legal history and an attempt to promote this legal settlement, this institutional and ideological settlement of the mid-20th century. The theories of justice, like the Rawlsian theories of justice, have this conceptual scheme, social contract, veil of ignorance, choice from an initial condition. So they appear to have all this abstract bric-a-brac, this abracadabra. But what they really are is a pseudo-philosophical prop to the homely practices of compensatory redistribution under social democracy. So the market generates all this wealth. We humanize it. Who are the progressives? The progressives appear on the scene, on the stage of history, as the humanizers of the inevitable. What is their program? Their program is the program of their conservative adversaries with a humanizing discount. Their task is to put a human face on the cruel project of their adversaries. Of course, a losing position in politics, because in real politics, whoever most credibly embodies the cause of innovation, of creation, of construction, controls the agenda. The others are just his accessories. So that's the scene in which we find ourselves. So what are we going to do? If we're going to have programmatic arguments, we have the classical social theory, which had this revolutionary insight, which it produced, which it allowed to be eviscerated or hollowed out, as Marxism was. And then we have these social sciences, which at the end of the day are what in the history of philosophy we would call right-wing Hegelianism. Their essential spirit is that the real is rational. But the way in which they replace transformative insight by retrospective rationalization is different for each of them. And I just gave one concrete example, which is the critique of the contemporary economics. So it's not possible now to attempt to define the missing theory of structure. And in fact, the normal way, the most promising way to do it, to produce such a view that would underpin our programmatic arguments, would not be in the form of general social theory at all. The normal way would be through the critique of the particular disciplines like economics or law, the two disciplines of power, the ones that are closest to power. But nevertheless, what I'm going to try to do as an expedient would be simply to describe some of the elements of a proto-theory of regimes and of regime change. Simply to map out some of the space of the alternative way of thinking, of understanding, for which we would have to search. So first, the first set of attributes is that we need to think of these structures as being not systems. They're structures, but they are not systems. Their elements reinforce one another, but they're not all together on a all at once, all or nothing basis. A second characteristic of this proto-social theory is that it does recognize the relation between institutional arrangements and the functional advantages or disadvantages that they make possible. And I can explain, one of the ways in which I can explain this idea is by reference to the conception of the path of least resistance, to which I've alluded earlier in the semester. So when there's an innovation in the world, like the innovations that are the content of the insular form of the knowledge economy that we now have, technological, organizational, conceptual, and institutional innovations, the tendency is for those innovations to be implemented in the form that least disturbs the ruling interest and the established preconceptions. That's what we could call the path of least resistance. The insular knowledge economy is a characteristic example of the path of least resistance. It takes this potential of a great revolution in economic life, which holds at the limit the promise of releasing or overturning the most constant regularity in economic life, which is diminishing marginal returns, releasing it by promising a form of innovation which, rather than being punctuated or interrupted, is continuous and internal to the process of production. It limits its larger promise. And that's always the most probable outcome in history. The most probable outcome is always the path of least resistance. But the path of least resistance is never the only path. There's always an alternative to the path of least resistance. What the path of least resistance has going for it is its proximity to the existent. What it has going against it, and what its adversaries can count on, is that it always understates or undermines the potential of the alternatives. So there's always another form of the innovations which has more potential. The knowledge economy for the many has more potential, not just more potential for inclusion, for equality, but more potential for productivity. And so there can be a struggle between the adversaries and the friends of the path of least resistance. Now, so these regimes, the institutional arrangements and ideological assumptions that compose these regimes are selected from the outcomes of these contingent sequences of conflict in history. Conflict over ideas, conflict over institutions. And some of them then allow for more functional advantages to produce, to destroy, to make war than others. And so there's a competition. There is a functionalist element, but it's not like the competition is a competition in some historical vacuum. It's not like a regime is being compared to all possible regimes. A regime is being compared to its rivals, to its immediate proximate rivals. So it's against the rivals that are present in the historical circumstance. And that's, in this sense, it's more like natural evolution, like natural history, because that's what the real thing is like. Any given level of functional advantage, any level of productivity, any level of effectiveness in making war can have alternative institutional bases. There's not a one-to-one relation between the functional advantage and its institutional presuppositions. So we discover experimentally or empirically the alternative institutional foundations of a functional advantage. And often these functional advantages have to do with the ability to mobilize resources, including human resources, on a wider scale. Now, for example, in the late 18th century, there was a development of new artillery technology. And the armies of revolutionary France had an advantage in the deployment of this technology, because to deploy it with its greatest potency, you had to be able to have flexibility in the field. So infantry that could be deployed flexibly combined with artillery. The autocratic societies against which France fought could not deploy it that way, because they were armies of sullen peasant conscripts who would run away if there were not soldiers with bayonets behind them, preventing them from running away. So the ability to use the technological equipment depended on this crucial imperative of plasticity. And plasticity was related to mobilization, and mobilization was related to inclusion, to democracy. So that's an example of how, in the real conflicts of history, we discover how alternative institutional supports can provide a basis for the heightening of the functional advantage. So the functional advantage works with the contingent accidental elements of history, and we empirically or experimentally discover the different social bases of the same functional advantage, the different sets of institutional ways of achieving the same advantage. Now, a third attribute of this theory of regimes that we would need is that it recognizes the variability of path dependence. Let me explain. Different regimes don't exist with the same tenacity or reality. The question is, how does a regime acquire a false semblance of naturalness and necessity? It acquires that semblance by entrenching itself and making its transformation difficult. It may be because, for example, it's an arrangement entrenched in the Constitution, or because there's some play of social forces that makes its revision hard, or because it's surrounded by an aura of sanctity. And that's when we begin to think of it as part of the furniture of the universe, as a natural object, rather than as our own creation. Or it may disentrench itself, and it may lend itself to revision in the light of experience. And this is a crucial attribute of institutional arrangements. Why? Because structural change has primacy over non-structural change. That's why we have these arguments. It's more important to change the structure that defines the primary distribution of advantage and opportunity, economic and educational, than to create some secondary distribution through compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation and compensatory social spending. So the first principle is structure has priority over compensation. But now, what will these structures be like? Will they be like a prison, which once we create them, we cannot escape from them? Or will they facilitate their own transformation in the light of experience? So our situation today, and the beginning of the 21st century, is like the situation of the classical liberals and socialists of the early 19th century, in the sense that we, like they, have reason to affirm the primacy of structural change over non-structural change. But unlike them, we have reason also to resist what they did, which was to deliver themselves to a legal and institutional dogmatism. So each faction of the classical liberals and socialists said, here's a set of rights and institutions which will make you both rich and free. Follow our formula and you will ascend. Now we have reason to resist, to be skeptical about those dogmas. And therefore, one of the most important attributes of our institutional arrangements is that they have this quality of allowing us to engage without surrendering, of facilitating their own transformation in the light of experience, so that we can be insiders and outsiders at the same time. That's one of the definitions of freedom. So the institutional arrangements now, and now comes another proposition of this proto-theory. The institutional promote prosperity, enrichment, one set of institutional arrangements, and then we have institutional arrangements that promote our emancipation from entrenched schemes of social division and hierarchy, our freedom, on another definition of freedom. The liberals and socialists of the 19th century believed that there was a pre-established harmony between the institutional conditions of our prosperity, of our material ascent, and the institutional conditions of our emancipation. We have reasons to disbelieve that, to say there's no automatic convergence. But we have also reason to resist the opposite dogmatism, which is that there's a tragic contradiction between the institutional conditions of our emancipation and the institutional conditions of our material ascent. So what is it reasonable for us to believe? What is it is reasonable for us to believe is that there is some possible area of intersection between the institutional conditions of our material ascent and the institutional conditions of our emancipation. And what is the characteristic sign of the institutions that are in this area of intersection? One of the signs is that they have the property that I just described, that they lend themselves to revision, that they promote our plasticity, that they disentrench themselves. That's what's necessary both to our material ascent and to our emancipation. So in other words, we can hope in the sequence of history to create institutions that are more hospitable to subsequent transformation, that diminish the influence of the past over the future, and in this sense, make us more free. So I've described the first set of attributes of the regimes, which is that they're structures, but they're not systems. A second, that they're related to functional advantage and to a competitive selection on the basis of their consequences. But there's no one-to-one relation. There's an empirical and experimental discovery of the alternative institutional and ideological foundations of the same functional advantages. And the third is that these different institutional arrangements can be more or less entrenched or disentrenched. They can naturalize themselves and insulate themselves against challenge and change, or they can, on the contrary, invite challenge and change. And the ones that invite challenge and change are superior and are the friends of our freedom. Now let me describe a fourth and final set of attributes in this theory of change and relate that to the problem of agency, which is a problem we've had all along in these programmatic discussions. Who were these alternatives for? What is their agent? And let me do that again by a polemical contrast to the Marxist idea of agency. So the Marxist idea is class interests have an objective content. And the more intense class conflict becomes, the more perspicuous, the more transparent the objective content of the interests of the classes is. Now, I want to turn that proposition on its head and say it's exactly the opposite. And take as on my point of departure David Hume's remark that men fight for their interests, but what their interests are is a matter of opinion. As conflict escalates in scope and in intensity, the question, what are my interests? And what is my identity as a member of a certain class or group becomes inseparable for the question, what are the adjacent, the accessible alternatives? And who would I be and what would I become under each of these alternatives? So then the objectivity of the interest is a false semblance, which presupposes stagnation. Whereas when there's a conflict about the alternatives, then rather than the objectivity of the group interest becoming more patent or more fixed, exactly the opposite happens. So take an example that we've discussed in the past. What is the interest of the historical constituency, the core constituency of the left parties in the West? The organized industrial working class headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, especially mass production, Fordist mass production. Is it their interest to dig themselves into their niche, like the Rust Belt industries in the United States, and defend it negatively against all comers? Defend it especially against the groups most proximate to them, closest to them in social and economic space, the small business class, the foreign workers, the temporary workers, and so forth? Or is it their interest to transform their declining industry into a version of the new thing, the knowledge economy, the inclusive knowledge economy? And in that project, then, the groups that they regarded as their rivals or enemies would have to become their allies. So in other words, there is always a duality of ways of defining and defending a group interest. There is a class of ways of defining and defending a group interest that is institutionally conservative and socially exclusive. And there is a class of ways of defining and defending a group interest that is socially solidaristic or inclusive and institutionally transformative. That's how we have to think about the problem of agency. So every programmatic proposal has two sides. In one side, it's a proposal for a succession of institutional transformations and transformations of the ideological assumptions associated with them. And on another side, it's a proposal for the making of a certain coalition, a political and social coalition. The latter is not a kind of afterthought. It's rather a second language in which we think out the same alternatives. Now, a much harder question, and this is where I'd like to end my discussion today, is to think of how the problem of agency of these alternatives presents itself to us today. This organized industrial working class is now increasingly seen by the other groups in society and ultimately comes to see itself as just one more special interest, rather than what Karl Marx thought as the bearer of the universal interests of humanity. And what then is its true successor in the world? In the world, in the large populous countries of the world, most people are poor and disorganized. But their horizon of aspiration, rather than being petty bourgeois in Karl Marx's sense, rather than being proletarian in Karl Marx's sense, is petty bourgeois. So what do they aspire to? The majority of men and women in the world today. What do they want? They want to have a small farm, a little shop, a trade that they can ply and for which they can receive a fee. The default form of their dream of ascent to modest prosperity and independence is petty bourgeois. Objectively, they're not members of a small business class, so we can't say they're an objective petty bourgeoisie. But they are a subjective petty bourgeoisie, and there are many, many more of them than there are workers in the shrinking sector of industry, the traditional constituency of the left-leaning parties. So the fate of humanity, of the contemporary societies, depends in the end on the position of this subjective petty bourgeoisie, which is the effective majority of humanity. But of course, it can't act in these divided and hierarchical societies in the world unless it has an ally in the elites. And it's unlikely to be successful in its aspirations unless there is some growth miracle in their country, in their society. So in order for there to be a transformation in the direction of the alternatives that we've discussed, there has to be a division in the national elite. The predominant element in the national elite is characteristically of rentiers, financial rentiers or rentiers of natural resources. And there has to be then a counter-elite, a dissident elite, which seeks and takes power and has a productivist and nationalist orientation. And this counter-elite has to garner support in the majority of this subjective petty bourgeoisie and offer that majority an alternative to its default aspiration of retrograde, isolated, archaic family business based on family saving and self-exploitation. So once again, the petty bourgeoisie, what are its interests? Is its interest to become an objective petty bourgeoisie? To join a small business class? That would be digging itself into its niche. The analog to the example I gave with respect to the industrial workers. And then to resist, to antagonize all the groups that threaten that. Or is its interest then to be lifted up, to come closer to the vanguard? And that's the form in which somehow it would enter the trajectory of the inclusive knowledge economy. Through a lift-up operation, through a 21st century equivalent to the 19th century agricultural extension. And what I'm claiming is that that's now the majority. That's the constituency. So if you ask then at the end of all of this argument that we've been having in this semester, who are all these alternatives for? These alternative forms of the market, these alternative forms of democracy. The answer is, they're for this majority of the subjective petty bourgeoisie. But it is impotent unless it finds its ally in the national elite in the struggle for power. It has to have as its ally the counter-elite with the productivist and nationalist orientation. Now, that's all I had to say in a very elaborate discussion in which we went from the dramatic pathologies of social theory to the problems of contemporary social agency. And I'm at your disposal now. Let's discuss this or any part of this. Yes?
So, you said or that we can hope to build institutions that invite challenge and change. And my mind immediately asked whether an institution can invite challenge without change, and if that's something that we see. I think about, like, I can imagine structures where they're promoting lots of free speech, lots of discussion, but they aren't promoting change in the institutions. Like, we want to have this institution, this mode of expressing ourselves, but we all want to be able to express ourselves. I'm curious if you think that, how you think that fits in with this idea of alternatives that you're presenting, and if that would...
Well, this fits in? What's the this?
Well, I guess this idea of if you've got institutions that are predominantly focused on, like, facilitating discussion, facilitating high temperature political discussion of some sort, how that...
I think that's not quite the main emphasis, so maybe I could explain it this way. So, the 19th century belief, the 19th century liberals, was there's a system of rights and liberal institutions of the market and a democracy or a proto-democracy, which are part of the definition of freedom. So that's what freedom means. Freedom is not just a set of abstractions. Freedom are these rights. Now, what do we think? I don't believe that we think quite that. What we think is that this may not be part of the definition of rights, but the problem is that any alternative to that ancient system of those liberal rights is dangerous to freedom. So it's a negative thesis. It's not the confident thesis of the 19th century that that's part of the scheme of order liberty. It's the thesis that the alternatives are inimical to freedom, to prosperity. And so then the discussion turns to, well, that depends on what the alternatives are. And that's why we've had all of these discussions in the course. That's the way in which we get into it. So given the skepticism about alternatives, there's no other way, right, except to engage in the debate about alternatives and to relate that debate to the practical problems of the contemporary societies. Now, I think there's this enormous difficulty with the vocabulary, right? So if you remember way back at the beginning of this course, I said that I was going to describe alternatives typically at a point which is neither very close to what exists nor very far from what exists. An intermediate point, a middle distance. And in an academic setting like this one, the middle distance is attractive because it lends itself to conceptual clarification. But it has a great disadvantage. The disadvantage is that the alternatives described at this middle distance tend to seem too far away from what exists to be feasible, but not far away enough to arouse enthusiasm. And that's why I argued, in the language of political prophecy and of transformative politics, we reject this middle distance, and we instead prefer to combine the very close to the very far away, the practical to the prophetic. But it's all the same thing. So you have to see this, you have to translate the discourse and understand that any trajectory of transformation worth thinking about can be described at points that are relatively close or relatively far away from the existent. Now then, the focus on this idea of disentrenchment, to which you pointed now in this comment, is then whatever regime we create, or as we create it, should not entrap us, right? It should provide an opportunity to transform it, to escape from it. And that's part of what we mean by freedom. And for every practical reason, because we don't know definitively what the path is. So we don't want to entrust our collective future to some dogma, to some institutional or ideological dogma, as the 19th century liberals and socialists did. We want to keep it open. Now, in the light of that, would you reformulate your question, or?
I think that makes sense and addresses what I'm thinking about. My concern was mostly towards whether an institution that, like the classical liberal institutions, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, whatever, could, the different roles they could play, depending on how they're deployed. What you're saying is the dogma behind them is the focus and concern.
So I think there's another vocabulary which I find useful, but which I haven't used so far, which is this. The social liberal and social democratic settlement of the mid-20th century was a discourse emphasizing the advantages of creating a haven of security against the storms, against the market especially, against economic insecurity, against political insecurity. So we had this whole narrative about the haven, but didn't have the narrative about the other part. The other part is the storm of innovation, of creation. The storm doesn't occur spontaneously. The storm has to be arranged. And a feature of this political imagination of the past century was all focused on the haven. What about the other part? And so the storm of creation in the economy, the storm of reinvention in politics, that has to be rearranged. And yet another way in which we could think of this is in relation to the illusions of romanticism. So and it goes to this question of disentrenchment. So what's the romantic premise? The romantic premise is, when are we fully human? We're fully human in those interludes in which we shake the hold of the structures. So the structures are like the hand of Midas, right? Killing the spirit. The romantic idea is we're fully human in romantic love, contrasted to the routines of married life, the crowd in the streets contrasted to the bureaucratic apparatus, and so forth. So the romantic thinks the structures will inevitably come back. They're inevitable. But we'll be fully human in those momentary interludes in which we break the hold of the structures. So romanticism is a form of despair about our power to change the relation between structure and spirit. And these ideas, by contrast, say, we don't accept that. So we think that we can, little by little, create structures that are more hospitable to the spirit and relativize the contrast between spirit and structure. This is a profound transformation in the character of human life, if we could achieve it. And after all, it's not qualitatively different from the transformations that have already happened in history. Imagine a spectrum of forms of social life. And at one pole of the spectrum is a scriptural caste order, not the actual caste order that exists in ancient India, but a simplified version of it, in which the individuals belong to the four classes of the Indo-European political imagination. They're the priests, the rulers, the fighters, and the peasants, say. And this corresponds to some hierarchy in the soul. And the security of the individual is entirely engaged in the maintenance of his form of collective life. So any challenge to the stability of that form of life is an assault on the identity of the individual. Now imagine another, at the opposite pole of the spectrum, a society in which we disengage the sense of the self from the rigidification of social life. We separate as much as possible so that we can change society, the storm, without assaulting the intimacy of the individual. Now, where are we on that spectrum that I've just described? We're not at the second pole. We're at some intermediate space, because the devices, like the property regime, the traditional regime of private law, the flawed forms of democracy, by which we affirm freedom, are also restraints on our freedom. So we're in some middle position on the spectrum. And the idea is that we continue traveling on the spectrum. That's another way of describing the idea of disentrenchment. And from that standpoint, the problem in liberalism, in classical liberalism, is the marriage of the liberal idea of freedom, the dream, with the particular institutional forms. So, of course, the institutional forms are restrictive, and they then have a restrictive influence on the content of the dream. As we transform the institutional arrangements, we transform our idea about our freedom. So that's the kind of argument. And I think the supreme difficulty of this exercise is that it's not as if we had the tools to do this. So in the conventional policy discourse of the technocratic elite in these societies, the idea is there are these social sciences, and they inform the policy discussion, right? I mean, that's like the Kennedy School. And this is a completely different idea, right? Because the idea is, that's not how we can create alternative. We don't have the ideas. And we don't have the agents for the ideas. And somehow we have to think our way into these alternatives little by little. And develop the intellectual equipment which we lack. Because where are the social sciences? The social sciences is right-wing Hegelianism, this normalization or rationalization of social life. There's a permanent campaign to suppress structural vision at these places like Harvard University. And so we have to create the intellectual instrument in the course of the activity. So further comments or propositions? I think I'm going to end up with very few friends in this campaign. But that's what I expected all along. I think, yes.
So this is stretching back a while to, so you were talking about this idea of a universal hierarchy, needing to challenge the existing universities.
No.
in my own way, not yours. So I can imagine cases where building up those systems at maybe a local level or regional level isn't done with this big heresy in mind of challenging the whole establishment.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, someone who's 2 steps removed looks and says, oh, across these 17 different places doing this, this is something that's motivating them all. This is the universal heresy, even if people don't realize they're a part of it. So my question from that is, do you think that an intention of creating a broad challenge to the existing regimes, not regimes of people, but regimes of structure and the way we're thinking about issues, is that intent required to be building towards these?
So what I think is that so the different nations of the world remain the nation states, the sovereign armed states of the world remain the main scene of political action. And that's where we create, or fail to create, these strong alternatives. Now maybe they won't always remain the main form of division within humanity, but they are now. And as I said earlier, in an earlier argument we had, there's been a change in the character of the national division. So the nations of the world used to be tribes based on common descent and similarity of experience. And that's what it meant to belong to one of these collective identities. To be a Roman was to live according to the customs of the early Romans, and so of the ancient Romans. So these are tangible and porous collective identities. And because they were porous, susceptible to compromise and to combination, to imitation. And now the nations of the world are on a journey, on a trajectory, in which they're becoming something different. They're becoming, at the extreme, forms of moral specialization within humanity. So each nation, then, is a different way of organizing society, a different way of being a human being. And along this road, there's an accident that occurs, which is the evisceration of the tangible collective identities. Again, I give the example of Japan, Meiji Restoration. So a dissident elite takes power and tries to preserve the independence of Japan. But paradoxically, in order to preserve the independence of Japan, it has to look around the world and raid all the other countries for examples of institutions that it can imitate. And then it has to combine some of these institutions from, say, the way that the Prussians organize their army or their general staff, and combine it with their own practices. So the result of this universal emulation, practical and ideological, is that the tangible collective identity is eviscerated, is hollowed out. The nation comes to the altar of the worldwide competition, and it tears out part of itself in order to be able to survive and to be independent. So then there's as the tangible collective identity is hollowed out, the different nations become more alike, paradoxically. And then we have what I think is the basis of the peculiarly poisonous character of contemporary nationalism. Two nations live side by side, and they come to hate each other, not because they're different, but because they're becoming alike. And there's the intransigent will to difference. This is the basis of contemporary nationalism, which is aroused even more as actual difference wanes. Because actual difference, if it is manifest in concrete custom, is always relative. Porous, as I said, susceptible to recombination. But the will to national difference is the object of an intransigent faith, which resists compromise. That seems to me to be the peculiarly poisonous character of the contemporary nationalist. And there are then three responses to this situation. The response of authoritarian nationalism is to say, restore the ancient differences. The response of liberal cosmopolitanism is suppress difference. The different nations of the world converge to the same best practices and institutions, and then the national differences are kind of folklore, a cultural folklore, floating over this reality of convergence. But the alternative would be to say, equip difference. Give the nations of the world the institutional arrangements, economic and political, that will allow them to create new difference. Difference is not the problem. Difference is the solution. And because real difference is the object of compromise, of imitation, of combination, as opposed to this emptying out of difference. Now, then I say, what should the proponent of alternatives propose? It shouldn't be like the progressives now do. They think the orthodoxy, social liberalism or neoliberalism, or the outcome of the neoliberal attack on social democracy, which is social liberalism, is the universal orthodoxy, and the heresies, now the progressives say, are local. The orthodoxy is universal, and the heresies are local. The heresies are composed of elements of the universal orthodoxy with national variations. And I want to say, a universal orthodoxy can be effectively combated only by a universalizing heresy. So I understand myself in this argument here that we've been having to be proposing a universal heresy. Obviously, we'll take different forms in different countries, but it's a heresy for the world, as liberalism and socialism were in the 19th century. Weren't they for everyone? That's what they were. They were universalizing heresies. But paradoxically, the universalizing heresy has as one of its aims to foment, to encourage the creation of these national variations. That's a paradox, or if you like, the tension. So that the world, so that humanity will be united by diverging, as it were. Now, is that a contradiction? So if it is, it's one of the contradictions of my argument. Now let me say, by way of anticipating then one theme in next week's course, and that's related to this discussion. Implicit in this discussion is an idea of freedom. So what is freedom? What substantively is the idea of freedom that animates this discussion? Freedom is a series of contradictions. So first, when am I free? I'm free, first of all, if I'm connected to others. I'm not free unconnected. But every connection threatens me. Every connection threatens me with subjugation, with loss of personal distinction. So the first sense of freedom is that I'm free if I can connect without loss of personal distinction, without being subjugated. And we can have an experience of this in personal love, because love, unlike altruism, is recognition of the other, imagination of the other, acceptance of the other, and not just sacrifice from on top, from a distance. But love can't flourish outside the domain of intimacy. So what's the equivalent to love in life among strangers? The equivalent is cooperation among free and equal individual agents, and the practical, economic, and political forms of that are the object of the contest in modern history, because there is no convergence, right? So that's one way of thinking about freedom. Now, the second way of thinking about freedom is, I'm free if I can engage in a particular world without surrendering to it. So it's not just that I have to be connected, I have to be engaged. Because if I'm in the forest, if I'm not part of a collectivity, of a society, I'm not free. But every society seems to require from us, as the condition of engagement, that we surrender to it. So I'm free if I can engage without surrendering. And if the society can be organized in such a way that it allows me to engage without surrendering, it allows me to deny the last word to that world, and to keep the last word for myself. So I can be an insider and an outsider at the same time. The order allows me to do that, and then I'm free. Now, the third contradiction is the relation of the self to itself. To be free, I have to have a way of operating in the world, a modus operandi, what the Greeks call a character. The self has to take a canonical and organized form, otherwise I'm not free. But if the character then becomes an icon that sucks the life out of me, I'm not free. I have to be able to have a character, to have a characteristic way of being in the world, of relating to the world, but I have to, at the same time, be able to disrupt that. Because if I can't disrupt it, I'm not free. So, in what society, in what culture am I more likely to be able to form a character and at the same time to rebel against it? Because that's also part of freedom. So this is what freedom is. Freedom is the combination of these contradictions, of these contradictory impulses, and their resolution in some form, which has to be both political in historical time and moral and biographical time. So we have these projects we've been discussing in the semester of the transformation of society. And we all like them to happen now, for us, while we're alive. But they don't succeed or fail in the span of a human life. They happen in historical time. So then we have to think of what happens. Now, St. Augustine said every age is equidistant from eternity, right? From that standpoint, it wouldn't matter. But for us, it does matter because we only have our lifespans, our lifetimes. So we have to think that one of the roles of moral vision, of ethics, is to serve as a substitute for politics. Ethics has to make up for the failures of politics. What we cannot achieve in historical time, collectively, we have to somehow be able to make up as moral agents in biographical time. So then we have another set of contradictions. Those are all descriptions of dimensions of freedom, and that's part of the normative background to these arguments. But they point to ambition, right? So it's a strenuous and demanding agenda. And one might think, you might look at it and say, I want to get off this roller coaster. And I just want to wallow in reality without any stress, without any contradiction. And I can't offer you that. Yes?
I was wondering, you said, it makes sense to me that cooperation among individual agents is the equivalency for
Yes, so the
love.
question is, what's the equivalent to love in life among strangers?
Is cooperation, but then you said
No, what I said is that cooperation among free and equal individuals is an abstract ideal. Its particular political and economic forms are the object of struggle in history. Because the market, what is the market? The market is a simplified form of cooperation among strangers, which is impossible when there is no trust and unnecessary when there is high trust. And different market orders may differ in their moral basis, whether they presuppose only a modicum of low trust universalized among strangers, which was Max Weber's idea, and those were the historical market economies, or the knowledge economy in its more ambitious form requires a heightening of the level of reciprocal trust and discretionary initiative required and allowed of all participants in the process of production. The same thing in politics. So, and what's the form of cooperation among strangers in politics? It's democracy. But of course, the forms of democracy are the object of a contest, which we've been discussing in the course. So that's the connection that I'm making. If we say that this is what freedom is. Freedom is the engagement with these contradictions. That's what freedom means, and that's how we become free in history. And not by delivering ourselves to a dogmatic form of the market or of democracy, but by struggling for this reinvention, this remaking, which brings us to life. And it's more important to be brought to life than to be brought to order. Well, we'll continue next week. This is a fabulous discussion to have, but we'll continue it. Hi. Yes. Of course. With pleasure. Hello. Yeah, sure. So the best time to talk to me is after every class. So I teach Mondays through Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday I end at 3, and Thursday I end at 3. So I'm usually in my office for like half an hour, 40 minutes after class. So that's the best time to speak. Yeah, right after. Yeah. Thank you.